Hey everybody, welcome to the final depth of field video, and this is the final video for the PgBokeh. We're basically finishing up, and we're going to get into just a demonstration of using real numbers in scale in regards to our Houdini render with a real live action scene, and seeing how the system actually works in regards to replicating real lenses with real data that's actually accurate to scale. Special thanks, obviously, to Tony Lyons and Adrian Pueyo for their contributions. Tony went ahead and put together, I did a little bit of finessing on this, but he basically gives a little demo here on how to create a custom kernel or bokeh, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we're also using Adrian's wonderful apChroma. This is free to download from the site. Which you can get the Nuke script. You obviously will need to install the demo version at the very least of PgBokeh to actually have everything work, and you might have to replace this PgBokeh here because it might be a different version, or I don't know, right there as well. So let's first start off with just a basic example, and this might be a little bit of a rehash for what we had before. So let me just kind of jump in here and show you guys. So here is a clip. Again, this is all using Adrian's stamps. So we got PgBokeh, and we talked about stamps in the earlier episode of Tool Time. So I would recommend you guys start getting into stamps. I've already found them to be incredibly useful, almost, you know, a necessary reality to organize. But this brings in this PgBokeh, which is being referenced way up here. And this is, from what I can tell, the demonstration that Tony Lyons put together for what you would do in regards to bokeh. Creating your own bokeh from, say, reference material, footage shot from the same camera on the day. Of course, we got all these artsy-fartsy filmmakers out there that want to use old lenses and so forth, and just basically like, okay, I want to get a specific bokeh shape, and I want it to be a la 1984, so I'm going to use this specific, you know, bokeh from this specific spherical lens that was used back when. So you can customize your own or just use footage. You can bring it in here. And this demonstration, again, you guys could tear this apart, copy and paste these at will, but you can see we're just basically cropping a specific bokeh in here, one of these. And it has a unique look to it. It's got these little tiny specks and so forth, not really showing too much chromatic aberration, so we're going to add some desaturation, and then there'll be a little bit of grading to get some contrast in there. So you can see a little bit of grading going on. And then we go through Adrian's apChroma to actually add a little bit of chromatic aberration. Now you can add chromatic aberration within the tools of PgBokeh, but I believe you cannot do that if a kernel input is coming in. So you got to add your own chromatic aberration. So you can see we're just adding this specific blue, and we went over this with Adrian, so check out the Tool Time episode. Create alpha channel from luminance. This is where we again take out the saturation, but we're using that as the alpha that's getting copied into here. So if you take a look at the A for alpha, we have an alpha channel of transparency for the bokeh itself. And then in this case, due to the fact that we're probably going to want to have things speed up really quick, and this does really bring down the computation of your PgBokeh if you go to a 256 by 256. So we're just bringing it down to 128 by 128 as far as the size itself. Now this will all depend on you, depending on the resolution. If you're doing a finish on a 4K footage, then you're probably going to want to go with 256 by 256. If you are looking to move into the world of anamorphic, you can enable these two options, which gives it a 2x squeeze, or you can do whatever squeeze you want. Like in my case, I use that anamorphic adapter, so I would do like a 1.33 squeeze, but in this case, you can see the scale's just been brought by 0.5 down in the width. So if you were doing the others, you probably do like a 0.7 if you're doing the anamorphic adapter. And then just to ensure, there's got to be one black pixel around the edge to maintain the bounding box. So you can see that is what he's doing here, and adds the black outside. So here we have our alpha and so forth, and it's looking nice and clean. This avoids some kind of artifacting. All right, so this basic scene I got set up here is just a 1/Z translation with renders using scanline render. So I just have some balls in the shot here. We know that each one of these units is technically inside of Nuke. I believe it is centimeters. So just being aware of that, and we can kind of look at this and see we got 3 squares. We have a camera right here. That camera itself is set to 50 millimeter. And it also has f-stop values, focus distance, and all that fun stuff. So let's go to our scanline render here and take a look at what we got. Okay, so without the PgBokeh, or even without this expression, I should say, if I go to my alpha channel, or I'm sorry, my depth channel, you'll see that this has a what's called a 1/Z, you know, delineation here. So you can start with like 0.38, and the numbers go smaller as you go further away to, in this case, probably the furthest thing in the scene. See that? So the numbers should be doing what's called real distance, so that the depth goes from a very small number to a high number. And to accomplish that, you just throw an expression in the mix, 1/Z, which I've got over here, into the depth. Okay, so that brings us into this real-time reality. So let's go back to RGBA alpha. And I'm disable this, re-enable it, so you can see what's going on here. So even though we do have a kernel input, the bokeh shape is just being created from a typical spherical reality. So if we come over here to the options, and again, we covered a little bit of this last time, is you have multiplier, front multiplier, a back multiplier. You have your depth style. In this case, we're using real. If we didn't have this expression right here, we would definitely want to make sure we're 1/Z, where as distance increases away, the depth of information, the number actually decreases. But again, the real is that the depth information closer to the camera is a very small number, and as it gets further away, it's real numbers. And it's all supposed to be based on a number of distance depth from the camera itself. And then we have the focal plane. Now it's currently set to 2.9. Okay. So again, if we go into our depth channel, you can see that if I kind of sample this area here, this is 2.9, which is somewhere around right there. Okay. Now if I go back in, there's obviously different ways of taking a look at this. We've got the lens bloom, which we can kind of see just the bloom itself, and I think I have lens bloom options on. The focal distance visualization, this is again showing you in the form of a classic sense. What's in focus will be red, what's out of focus background would be black, blue, and what's out of focus foreground would be actually green. So, and then we go to the focus mat, and the focus mat is just showing you an A and B foreground background. Okay, you can see this if you kind of like just put your cursor over here. Front and back mats for the focus. So in other words, anything in green is front, anything blue is back. All right. So that will play a part when you understand the front and the back multiplier. And this is your artificial way of creating depth of field. It's not physically accurate because you're basically breaking the laws of physics here. So I'm going to go back to the defocused image here, and you can see this is what's in focus right here. So what I can do is take my front multiplier, which is like at 23 right now, which is really just this area right here, and I could start taking that and increasing that. So if I pull that up, now this area that's technically in front of the focal plane will actually start to multiply. And then the back multiplier obviously is the back multiplier that we can see here. So you can see if I take this down, it's only isolating what's back. And what's commonly, again, the falloffs are a little bit different depending on, you know, what sort of system you're using, what lens system you're dealing with, whether anamorphic or spherical. But they should be equally both left and right. So you can see multiplier to a certain degree is taking both and multiplying both. So I'm going to undo that, leave it. And as right now it's set to depth style real. That's because the numbers are going from backward to forward. And then you can change your focal plane if you wish. So again, if you come in here and you choose your focal distance visualization, I can go ahead and dial this in to go a little bit further back. And then you can see there's that red line. You guys see that? And the actual area that is fully in focus, focus region size, you can increase that. And that in the red color will actually be the in focus area. So again, if we were to pull this back to RGBA, oops, sorry, put this back to defocus image, you can see now we have more depth of field, so to speak, more areas in focus before things start to go out of focus. So I'm going to put that back to 10, and it'll be a nice fall off there, maybe like 5 or 2. There you go. The focal region fall off, obviously, if we come over here and go back to focus distance visualization, whether you're doing a linear fall off or a quadratic fall off, you're going to see it's going to be highly different here in regards to what's in focus and what's out of focus. So if you guys don't know already, quadratic fall off is basically, you basically lose a quarter of the influence every unit, or you're basically 1/4 of what you had before. Linear is just a linear progression. So you also have this defocus matte edge. So if I go ahead and put this back to defocus image, we currently are getting a nice bloom bokeh over here with these balls back here. So if I hit disable and re-enable, you can see starting to get a bloom. And if I wish, I can use this rotomat right here with the plugged in matte input to put that to my RGBA input because I'm outputting alpha. So now you can see, disable and re-enable, only the areas that are masked are visible. So I'm going to turn that off. You also have normalization visualization out here. So again, if I'm looking at this from focal distance right here, if I have normalization off, it's going to give you some really weird colors based on values that are above 1 and below 0. So again, you want to have this on, so it gives you this kind of normalized 3-color system of green, red, and blue, so to speak. And that's pretty much it for that. And this all runs by itself until you start turning on this real-world lens simulation. Then this stuff sort of goes out the window. So before we even get started with that, let's just jump into the optical artifacts. So again, I'll put this back to defocused image. And as you can see, we are getting a bloom, and the bloom is going to be based on the pixel value. So you can see if you kind of hover over it, it says the level of lens blooming. And then you have the threshold, which is the point at which the object actually blooms. So if we look at this object disabled and sample the color information, I've actually overcranked the color information of these dots to be above 1 values. So you can see right now they're looking at values of like 4.2 and so forth. So what it's saying is the minute you hit a value, then it's allowed to actually start blooming. So 0.715 is way below the threshold. So if I were to come in here and turn this on, and if I were to put this to something crazy like 5, which is above that, you'd see that you no longer get that threshold. So 0.7 is pretty high, and we're already getting that blooming. You also have the curvature here, which we'll get into. Spherical aberration. That's chromatic aberration, and I believe we should start to be seeing some aberration there. You can also use the matte input for the matte channel as well, so using this right here, you can change that up. Let's actually get some aberration. There we go. So spherical aberration, and again, you can use the matte here, turn that on. And as you can see, we should only be getting chromatic aberration in the areas that are masked. I think we are. Could be wrong on this one. Blue matte alpha channel. Yeah. I think it's still working. Yeah. So that's the bloom itself, not necessarily the chromatic aberration, but the bloom. But if you want to have chromatic aberration matte, then yeah, you click on this right here. Now you can see there's only chromatic aberration in the mask. And again, this is taking in the information under the mattes, so it's probably to do a couple shuffle copies if you wish, or just have rotos with specific channels for red, green, and blue, so you can get multiple channels in there. If you have multiple channels for what you decide to have chromatic aberration, it doesn't have chromatic aberration, have bloom, doesn't have bloom. And then the curvature, again, we can kind of play with that a little bit. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to turn off all of this, and we are going to switch over to from circular to, we got aperture blades. So you guys know aperture blades. You can do a aspect ratio of 2, and now you've got some sort of similarity to anamorphic. And you can, if you were like using the anamorphic like I do, 1.33. People claim it's actually 1.25. I'm not sure on that. We'll see. And then of course you got the softness. You've got the blade count. You know, you can make it whatever. And then the curvature and the rotation. Okay. So currently this is the little tricky part. Make sure whatever your kernel size is matches up. So in our case, if we were to turn on input, which is coming in from our input right here, and we were to put this to something like 256, we would get this weird like quarter moon artifact. So you got to make sure your maximum kernel size actually matches up to what's being outputted over here. In our case is 128. And again, if you want 256, put this to 256. And then it's good to have expand boundary box to max kernel size so you don't get no clipped artifact or our truncated artifact. So now we're working off of the image that's coming in through the input here. So you can see we have the kernel input, as you can see, and we can come back here and it looks like you can still bloom out. See if I can kind of get these blooms back here. This still affects the final image apparently. But you can see if I kind of dial down all this stuff, the image is still getting its nice chromatic aberration from the input. Remember, the input is right here. This is the input that we're actually now replicating each bokeh ball. It's interesting, during this lockdown, we went out to walk in these forest areas. Everybody's becoming an outdoorsman all of a sudden. And I just noticed as the light was pouring through the top of the canopy of the trees, it was actually creating little out of focus bokeh circles, which was pretty cool. I'm like, oh, look at that. It's like a camera. So anyway, with that said, it's just a thing in nature, the circles of confusion, and they are confusing sometimes. Alright, so with that said, I believe we are good on that. And again, when you're dealing with this, you want to make sure that your settings, if you're doing an input, just make sure all this stuff is probably set to 0, 0, 0, unless you want to have some softening. If you want to have some curvature, you want to have some rotation, just leave all that, because you really want what is coming through your input here to shine. And again, I can exaggerate this so I can see it a little better by coming over here and taking my back multiplier and maybe bringing it up to 60. Now I'm really starting to see what I created over here, which is this guy right here. Okay, so moving on to more to go here. Correct the slices. If you guys have any opinions about this, please put it at the bottom, why it's useful. I've got very little information on it, and I've tried contacting the good folks over at, I believe it's Pellegrine Labs for PgBokeh. Have not got a word back from them, not a single email. I've asked them many questions, and I haven't got a single response whatsoever. So I don't know if they're super busy or what. Obviously, we're in a pandemic. I don't know if anybody's in the office. But regardless, you can see it's pretty helpful. Now, let's talk about a real example of this. So here is, and again, special thanks to my nephew Matt for volunteering for this. He did have a promo for his YouTube channel, but I think he's erased his YouTube channel. The deal was, hey, help me with this and I'll help you promote your YouTube channel. He does a video game YouTube channel, but I think he's gotten tired of that. But regardless, he volunteered to do this little shot with this drone. Again, we've used this in previous demonstrations here. So I'm also incorporating DOS grain at the very end, so it's nothing really for you to pay attention to, but it's good to learn from. So again, you could load this up and learn from it. And again, I probably, if you guys have any improvements you want to throw at me, that would be great. I have 2 examples of 2 different kernels in here, and I'm also using Tony's black match tool, which is really awesome. So if you guys are interested in using that. So here's the drone footage being referenced in from the stamp, and it actually has the background in it. And this is what it is. And we're just, it goes through some grading and highlights, and I basically try to make these little red lights kind of very bright so that they get some nice bokeh going on. So this was an actual camera that, if I go ahead and just take a look at it here, it was a scene tracked, way out here. It was a scene tracked, obviously, just with a panning shot. But everything inside of Houdini was actually physically accurate. So every unit was in the meters is what Houdini uses. So I made sure that the distance of where the drone was compared to where it should be to my nephew in the foreground was perfectly right, which was about 17, I believe it was about 17 meters. So, and that's from the inside of the garage all the way to the outside where there was a street, suburb, sidewalk, street, and that's where the actual drone was. It was out on the street. So here's the camera that I actually tracked for. Here I had to do use a little bit of that depth of field trick so that, again, if I go over here to my depth channel, just using this old classic unpremult workflow, kind of expanded out the edges so that we don't have, black data along the edges here. So this just is good for a lot of things. And that's from the glow, I think, or something. I'm pretty sure. Could be a mistake. I don't know. But anyway, let's keep going down here. All right, so there's the drone itself. Kind of comes into the shot and so forth. Now I have a switch here plugged into the kernel for two different operations. And I guess using the same tool set that Tony introduced. In this case, again, we're just using that picture from before. But I'm also using, in this case, a frame hold where I managed to get a nice bokeh in the rack focus. So if we kind of go through this, I go through the same process again. So here you can see another example of building your own bokeh using apChroma, and the same sort of process parallel to this. And let's go ahead and just go into the PgBokeh now. Now, here is the conundrum I have, and I'm hoping that the audience of experts that are watching might be able to answer this question, because this has been a weird anomaly. And I'll just go ahead and show it to you. So here's the PgBokeh, and we are turning on real-world lens simulation. I'm putting in the Blackmagic Pocket 4K aperture width and height. This stuff is actually being copy and pasted from the actual camera solve. So originally in the camera solve, I made sure that the camera tracker, I should say, I put in the actual Blackmagic Pocket 4K sensor size and all the data that I currently had, which was a focal length of 25, which with a 1.9 crop factor gives you about a 50 millimeter equivalent of field of view. So that information's been dialed into this PgBokeh. And if you turn on, the minute you click on real world lens simulation, all this is doing, first off, is overwriting this stuff. And it's just reading the focal length and aperture from the camera that we currently have plugged in. So here's the camera. It's reading it's reading the f-stop and the focus distance. Now, just like we had earlier guests on before, that you can actually have tracking departments or match move departments give you a camera with the focal distance animated, and that's what we have here. So if you take a look at this camera and we go over here to our dope sheet, or curve editor, I should say, and go to the focal point and frame it. This is the rack focus that goes from my nephew to the drone and then back to my nephew. So again, it starts here about, again, this is in meters. It gets to about 15 meters. That's how far it is, and it goes back to how many, less than a meter for my nephew. So this is all real time based on real numbers and real scaling taken into account inside of Houdini ahead of time so that this will work. And according to the experts, we should have a bokeh that is physically accurate in this process. So with that said, let's come over here and we're going to go ahead and use the bokeh. So we're at the switch 0 of the original image right here. And that's going to be our bokeh. And I'm going to plug that into our PgBokeh. So I'm going to start at a frame where this thing should be out of focus, which should be right about here. And again, this is very computationally expensive. I can see why a lot of people are just using Z defocus node because it's probably a lot faster, I'm assuming. So here's a frame where everything is out of focus, and as you can see, it's replicating that beautiful captured bokeh that I grabbed from that still image there. And we're getting a nice little blooming effect. And this is in accordance with, if you guys take a look, proper focal distance and so forth. And I'll just plug it in to the final image here. We'll go all the way down here. We can just ignore a lot of this stuff. So after DOF grain and all that fun stuff, you can see that we have a bokeh that actually matches correctly, physically accurately to the scene. Now this is a bigger light than these tiny lights. So if you're like saying, well, how come this is not the same scale as this? Well, that's just the fact that these are smaller here. And then again, you can adjust these if you want by coming into your PgBokeh. And remember, you got to base it on the measuring system you did inside of your 3D application. So again, if we come over here to the lens and we have real world simulation, we can click this off, and then this will be fed by something else. But I'm reading even the physical f-stop that was on the day. I knew of the f-stop that I filmed with. So if you come over here to my camera, you can see the f-stop's 1.8. So again, these are all things that I'm taking into account to exactly what I had on the day itself. So it looks pretty accurate. Again, I'm using world scale meters. That's what you use in Houdini. You can take your world scale multiplier, and if you start to decrease this, you'll start to get an amplification of the size of the bokeh. If you need to match it up to something just a little bit bigger or smaller, this is the tool that you want to use. You don't want to go over here and start playing with the front back crap unless you want to, which I don't think you can. And then of course the film format, that's coming in from the input as well. But you can dial this in too if you just turn off real-time lens simulation. All this is doing is feeding the information for your aperture width, aperture height, your aperture, and your focal length. It's all coming from this, that if you have a good motion tracking department, match move department I should say, they should have all of this in here for you, and it should match up perfectly. But if it doesn't, as Tony would recommend, you have to go in there and make tweak adjustments to make sure it's physically accurate. And again, I could go over here and switch this over to the other bokeh, and this should change it up from the bokeh recorded from this little bokeh here to the still image example. And there you go. So now we got the octagon looking thing there. And then of course, if you want, you can turn on anamorphic, and we should get an anamorphic feel. And again, this is the more I study anamorphic lens flares and spherical lens flares, it really blows my mind how the shape and the very nature of it changes. It's not as simple as just a single shape. There's a lot of things in it that actually transform and shift and turn into half moons. So it's really something that you got to study on your own through reference material, as all of our guests would recommend, and going in on your own and being inventive and trying to manipulate things to match with your footage. So I'm going to go over here and switch this back to 0 here. So this is the part where I'm looking for an expert out there to help me understand what the issue is here. This is doing the rack focus based on the camera, keyframing the actual focal distance or focal plane, and I'm getting this weird artifact specifically with PgBokeh. And as you can see, I've went ahead and done my own work to make sure that the bokeh matches here, so you can see when everything's in focus, these lights are relatively the same size. So I think I messed with the scale a little bit, the world scale, to try to match up and get the bokeh to be roughly the same size as you can see here. But my problem is the number of steps of the work from being in focus to out of focus is literally like 3 steps. So watch, if I use my arrow keys, you can see we go from one layer of blur to, jumps to another, and that's it. There's only, the actual animation of the curve from in focus to out of focus is going, but I'm only getting actual 3 steps of focus to defocus. And the same thing on the way out. So you can see we go from this to this to this, and it's only like 3 or 4 steps, and I need more steps. So I was figuring that possibly this had to do with this right here. I was guessing that corrective slices had to do with it, and I put it up even more, and I still was getting the same result. I was playing around with the override near far. So if there's anybody out there that can kind of explain this, or maybe think of a remedy to the situation that you just saw, that would be helpful. So with that said, thanks everybody for sticking with me through this whole thing. Again, I'll keep you guys updated on more fun tutorials coming soon, and we got many more interviews coming, so check you later.